Ultramarines, the bastions of the Imperium of Man, fight back across the stars against the unrelenting darkness. No world will fall at the hands of Xeno forces.
Yeah, sorry. I'm Tommy Thompson, this is AI in Games, and for this episode we enter the 42nd millennium, the Era Indomitus, the Age of the Dark Imperium. We learn how the enemy AI of Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 is designed both to enable the power fantasy of playing as a member of the Ultramarines, and how heresy is punished by ensuring those that do not commit their all to the Indomitus Crusade will most assuredly be wiped out. Developed by Saber Interactive and released in 2024, Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 sees the return of Demetrius Titus after a century of imprisonment, torture, and later self-imposed penance as a member of the Death Watch. Returning to active duty as a lieutenant of the Ultramarine 2nd Company, Titus acts to stop the Residious system from being lost in the broader battlefield of the Fourth Tyrannic War. As Titus or other members of the company in either campaign or separate operations in single or multiplayer, you fight against the enemies of the Imperium across various battlegrounds. Your initial deployment takes you to the jungle planet of Kadaku, where seemingly endless hordes of Tyranids wash over the landscape. What may seem unstoppable as they lay waste to all that stands before them merely waits to be crushed under your armored heel. Space Marine 2 revels in the chaos of having players face off against vast numbers of enemies at once, with a variety of smaller Xenos taking up the bulk of the invasion fleet, while larger and more aggressive enemies will beat down on the player in both ranged and hand-to-hand combat. Saber's latest entry in the series builds on the core gameplay established by the previous entry, developed by Relic Entertainment and released back in 2011. Gameplay is balanced across both close quarters combat, with light and heavy attacks, dodging, parrying and more, alongside the ranged combat that allows for a variety of weapons to eliminate enemies from afar. As detailed by Vladislav Yancevich in an AI post-mortem of the game, it was explained that for the development team, the driving philosophy was to achieve what was referred to as power through combat. It's a design philosophy that aims to have players want to push towards the enemy, to dive headfirst into the fray, hold their ground, and survive each encounter, by allowing the player to restore armor through use of finishing moves, but also parries and gunshots help dictate the flow of combat. It reinforces not just the power fantasy of being a super soldier, but it also adds what Saber refers to as the competence fantasy, in that the better you are at the game, the more deftly you can fight off even the most elite enemies. It reinforces the experience as players become seemingly unstoppable on even higher difficulties. This is a design philosophy we've seen in other games, notably back in episode 30 of AI in Games when we looked at the 2016 reboot of Doom, where the push-forward combat philosophy is built to encourage players to get in close and rip and tear as much as possible. To establish this in Space Marine 2, the development team worked on a design framework where they sought for enemies to be able to influence how and when the player switches from ranged to melee and back in the heat of the moment. Specific enemy archetypes should force the player to switch playstyle and make interesting decisions emerge throughout play, so every encounter keeps you on your toes. But when building a system like this, there's a delicate balance needed to ensuring this feels entertaining without it becoming overwhelming or overtly scripted. So let's take a look at how it all comes together. The underlying architecture of Space Marine 2's AI system is built on many a tool we've seen before on AI in Games, but it builds on existing ideas in ways that are quite interesting. So first, I'll give a brief overview of the tools employed and where we have seen them before, and then we dig into some of the more interesting technical aspects of it all. First things first, the core decision-making system of the enemies in Space Marine 2 is behavior trees, a common means through which to design and build behaviors for action games, and we've seen it explored on this channel in everything from Halo to Alien Isolation, The Division, and many, many more. The behavior tree is where each of the individual behaviors that enemies in Space Marine 2 use are implemented, and the system will trigger specific actions in certain contexts, and I'll explain how in a moment. Secondly, the game uses a utility AI system. As discussed in our AI 101 episode on the topic, utility is a process whereby we determine the viability or importance of some aspect of the AI's decision making. This could be a single action, an entire behavior, a goal it tries to accomplish, or even objects in the world. We've seen utility adopted in various ways on this channel over the years. Fear scores the value of a goal based on utility, meanwhile the multiplayer bots in Halo Infinite assess the importance of a behavior using the same approach. To handle the attacks of multiple Xenos at once, the game relies on an attack token system, a process where you manage which enemies can attack and at what time, by essentially giving the AI permission to attack the player. We've seen this in several games on the channel over the years, though two prime examples are the aforementioned 2016 reboot of Doom, plus we saw it in Marvel's Spider-Man by Insomniac in episode 74, where it has to balance between on and off-screen attacks by both melee and ranged enemy types. And then on top of the underlying attack system, the game has an engagement subsystem that watches all player activity and then decides which Marines should be the active targets. This is derived from the idea of a director, first seen in Left 4 Dead, in which enemies prioritize specific characters based on whether they are respecting the designer's underlying intent. So these are the four key pillars of the AI system in Space Marine 2, but each is doing something a little different from what we've seen before. Now, let's dig into the details and find out what exactly is going on. The enemies in Space Marine 2 are deliberately designed to avoid being overtly strategic. Enemies don't plan on long-term strategy to push the player into specific scenarios. As was discussed in Jancevich's talk, this would make little sense when you consider how anarchic a lot of the combat is throughout the game. So instead, the enemies are built to have two key behavior types. Reactive behavior, which as the name implies mean they simply respond to what's happening in the moment, but also opportunistic behavior, where an enemy will try and use a basic behavior with the specific aim to force a specific reaction out of the player. To pull this off, the AI team developed a modified form of a behavior tree known as a reactive behavior tree, in which the idea is to allow for characters to always be able to quickly react to what's happening in the game at any point in time. One of the big innovations was the use of an active selector node in the tree. Now, a regular selector, as we discussed in the AI 101 episode on behavior trees, will select one of the several children it has to activate. To do that, it checks whether each child action can activate from left to right, and if one of them can be executed and it succeeds, then the selector has ultimately achieved its job. But this doesn't allow for enemies to react to change in the game quickly, given the selector is just trying to find any action in that part of the tree it can complete. Long-term viewers of the channel will recall that one of the big innovations when Bungie designed behavior trees in Halo 2, as discussed way back in AI in Games episode 9, was the use of what are referred to as stimulus behaviors. This would force an override in the behavior tree and make it restart execution from the root if something had changed. A notable example being when an elite is killed in front of the grunts under its command. Space Marine 2's active selector nodes are an alternative approach to enabling for fast reactions. Instead of the selector only considering each action in turn and then evaluating whether it's possible, the active selector not only executes a particular branch, but it's still evaluating every behavior to the left of it. Actions are structured in each selector so that the rightmost behaviors are basic attacks that could prove opportunistic, while the actions to the left are all reactive. This means that whenever any enemy is attempting a more opportunistic attack or action, it can attempt to override it using a reaction, because it's always evaluating everything to the left of the current one in the selector. How does it evaluate them? Well, with utility equations, of course. When building action combat games, it's important that the gameplay feels somewhat balanced. If it's too overwhelming, then that's just not any fun. As mentioned earlier, the key to Space Marine 2 is it fulfills the power fantasy of being an ultramarine alongside the competence fantasy of being highly skilled and overcoming that which descends upon you. But on the other hand, if it's not intense enough, then the game will feel empty, lifeless, and far less engaging. So we need to maintain systems that will ensure not only that players feel the heat when required, but also that when they're in combat, it still feels like a fair fight. Combat encounters in Space Marine 2 rely on the underlying engagement subsystem to decide a number of key elements. identifying which Xenos should be passive, evaluating which Marine to attack, as well as reactive, where they will target a specific character based on the current context of the game. It handles the distribution of smaller Xenos that swarm players, it recalculates the accuracy of ranged attacks based on what's happening in the moment, and critically it supports the power through combat philosophy by making enemies less effective if the player is more skillful, more aggressive, but also makes them more punishing if the player is not engaging in combat. Now this is handled for a variety of different circumstances. Each encounter in the campaign is crafted manually by designers, meanwhile the skirmishes in the encounter missions are procedurally generated, so the system has to handle for both sets of scenarios. To decide on which Ultramarine should be attacked, the engagement system operates much like Left 4 Dead, where it's assessing each Ultramarine to determine which one should be attacked and who is the current priority. The game monitors how many Xenos are attacking each Marine, and tries to distribute them somewhat evenly, though it will bias towards human players where necessary, but this is just for passive enemy selection. It's also reacting to what players are doing, and it does this in two key ways. The first is that it maintains a short-term memory of events that occur on the battlefield. This helps when multiple players are attacking the same larger enemy. If, for example, one of them is trying to flee or taking damage, while the other one is pumping lead into the Xeno, then the enemy will reprioritize and shift targets. The second is that the game also pays attention to whether or not a player is actively in combat. So if you're being a coward and letting your NPC allies take all the heat, then you're not only likely to have a swarm of enemies turn to target you, but also you're more likely to have a dangerous attack trigger from off-screen, which will require either a parry or a dodge. That's what you deserve, you filthy heretic. Speaking of attacks, as mentioned, the game relies on a token system like we've seen in Doom, where a limited number of tokens are available for a given encounter. Each token is given to an NPC to attack the player, and it is relinquished once the attack is complete, or if another condition results in the enemy losing the token, like the attack being blocked, the enemy being killed, or more importantly, if it's stolen by a larger high-priority enemy. This happens a lot with special enemy archetypes as well as bosses. There are also unique distribution rules for tokens that vary depending on the game mode, but also based on the current state of the game. In an approach that's similar to Marvel's Spider-Man, attack distribution is reduced if the player is in the thick of it, by attacking enemies, parrying enemies, perfectly dodging dangerous attacks, or executing an enemy. It forces the game to slow down the rate of attack selection. This circles back to the power through combat idea, meaning that players are rewarded for sticking it out and giving their all in the name of the Emperor. But also, the distribution rules change in other circumstances. For one, any time the player is knocked back from one of the larger enemies, or they trigger a gunshot, this forces a cooldown and delay, a deliberate response to give you a second to breathe, either because you're getting your ass kicked, or you are kicking ass. But the game also has unique rule sets for when it observes that the player appears highly skilled, frequently parrying or dodging attacks, as well as when players are distributing massive amounts of damage. In those situations, it will crank things up to suit. The one part of this system that stands out as unique is the separate token system used by the smaller enemies. As you'll have seen throughout this video, attacks are often triggered by literal waves of smaller Tyranids attempting to overwhelm the player. The attack system has a set of custom rules just for these smaller enemies, and critically it pays attention to whether the player is prioritizing them or not. Should you ignore them and instead target the larger enemies, then over time the attack rate of the smaller enemies will increase, forcing you to deal with them. Their attack rate will slowly ramp up during the encounter, but knocking them back, or of course just killing them, will slow that overall rate of increase. Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 is a great example of how to build upon core design pillars to enable for a frenetic combat experience, all the while ensuring it's balanced sufficiently to enable players to still progress. The game is no cakewalk by any stretch, with even the lower difficulties proving a real challenge for aspiring Ultramarines, but for those who give their all in service of the Emperor, they'll find their groove and overcome anything that comes their way. After all, the game is literally built to make that fantasy a reality. Thanks for watching this episode of AI in Games, all about Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. This was a video I was excited to bring to you for a couple of reasons. I mean, of course, Space Marine 2 was one of the most beloved games of 2024, being nominated for several Game of the Year awards in the process, and it's arguably the definitive rendition of everyone's favourite British space fascists in games. But more importantly for us, it marks the very first episode of AI in Games that was based on a talk delivered at our very own AI in Games conference. In November of 2024, we hosted our first ever event dedicated to bringing together the game AI community. And this was in fact where Vladislav Jancevic delivered the AI postmortem. Sadly, he couldn't be with us in London to deliver the talk personally, but it was very well received by our attendees. When you consider that AI in Games started out by repurposing talks and development materials from across the games industry to make them more palatable to a general audience, the fact we've now gone full circle and made an episode from an event that we hosted and organised, well, that's something pretty special right there. If you'd like to see Vladislav's talk yourself, head on over to the AI in Games conference YouTube channel at the link on screen and in the description. It goes into even more detail than this video, so consider this episode an onboarding to the full presentation. The AI in Games conference YouTube channel is the home of all recordings from talks hosted at our event, so be sure to subscribe as we continue to roll out new content throughout 2025 and beyond. As always, you can continue to support my work via crowdfunding on Patreon and Substack. My thanks to everyone as we roll out into another exciting year of all things AI in Games. Stay safe, take care, and I'll be back.